Okay, so really quickly before we start actually taking notes, a couple of things to talk about from yesterday and Cami. So it's finally working today. I think I changed the due date to Wednesday, but I'll go back and change that due date to Wednesday. So that'll be due Wednesday. That'll be what you need to start working on when we get finished with this assignment is those worksheets from Friday, the Jim Crow and all that. Second, the idea for the rest of this week is we're just going as normal. We'll finish this section 2 today. You do have an assignment about Native Americans that we'll look at. Wednesday, you'll have just that assignment and not a lecture, and we'll continue on Thursday. But I do want to talk in the event that we do all go virtual after Thanksgiving. I know, and I'm hoping that everybody during this 2 weeks that we're doing everything we can to prevent us from going virtual, because I don't want to do that. I know you guys don't want to do that, but I do want to have a quick conversation about what this class will look like if we do go virtual, just so that I don't have to. So I guess maybe to kind of ease your mind about all that stuff that's happening. So if we go virtual, we'll continue our class as normal because this is dual credit. We do have to get to a certain point for you guys to receive the full credit for dual credit. But the way that I did my virtual kids last May was recording videos. I usually did them the night before so that the day, your school day, they were ready for you. You could watch them anytime during the school day. Kept with my same usual. Things are due at 11:59. Even test, I didn't make them do it at certain times. And my reason, and this is just me, I know every teacher has the right to do that, but my reason is I would think about what I would be like, what my life would be like as a junior if I had to do this stuff from home. And so my junior year, I have a sister that's 8 years younger than me. Both of my parents worked. I would have had to babysit. I would have been responsible for her doing her stuff online. I had a sister that's a year younger than me. That's the most annoying person on the face of the earth. And if she knew that I needed to be in a meeting or something, she would have done everything possible. Those of you that babysit little siblings, like my sister would have been 8. You can't leave an 8-year-old sibling who knows if something happens and she does something, she doesn't get in trouble, I get in trouble. Any of you have the younger siblings that happens to? Or are you guys the younger siblings? And you know that. But anytime anything happened in my house, I was always the one that got in trouble for it. So that would have been an issue. But the most overriding issue was in my junior year, my parents were at the end of 3 years of a horrific, horrible, loud, gigantic, messy divorce. And that would have meant at any time if I had to be on a Zoom meeting, my parents could have been having not World War III, but War 847 and door slamming. And my mom, one day when I came home from school, walking with all my friends, was throwing all my dad's albums off the balcony and cussing as she threw every single one of them, which is humorous now. And it was pretty humorous then because my mom was only 4'11". She could barely see over the railing of the balcony, which was funny in itself. But that's what was happening in my house when I was a junior. So I don't do Zoom meetings. I don't do them because that's why I don't do them. What I did do was once a week, I would schedule just a fun, anybody want to get on here and talk to me? And sometimes you did, sometimes you didn't. Sometimes it was me and 2 other people. Sometimes it was me and 5 other people. Show me your dog, talk about what you like, talk about TV shows. I will ask though, because I do this, my husband works out of town. One night when I was recording, I think it was my A-Push kids. I was fairly certain someone was breaking in my basement. So I took my laptop down, like pretty sure someone's breaking in my basement. So A-Push kids, if you're watching this tomorrow and you don't hear from me, please call the police because I'm dead. But I will anyway. So that's what I hope that we don't have to go to that. But if we do, that's the way I do class. I don't do Zooms. I don't do Google Meets. I don't do any of those. mostly because I don't think we have anything that requires us to talk like that, like not like a math class. I certainly understand why you need it for math and all that. But anyway, all right, questions about any of that before we get started? All right, so we're in Section 2, Western Expansion. So now we're going to move out west and look what is happening out west. Oh, and lastly, you guys, on these days that you're not here, again, I put the video. This is exactly what's on the video is this PowerPoint. So you can mute it and just go through and fill out the PowerPoint if you don't want to listen to me and all my extraneous stuff that I talk about. All right, so our objectives. This one is our first meeting with Native Americans. Compare the way Native Americans and white settlers viewed and used the land, describe conflicts between white settlers and Indians, and then evaluate the impact of Indian wars. What has happened, again, that we didn't discuss or study is what happened in those time period after our first colonists got to Plymouth and now. And what has happened is all of those Indians that were between the West Coast and the Appalachian Mountains, all those Indians have been pushed into the interior of the United States. They're in places like Oklahoma, they're in places like North Dakota and South Dakota, and they've been pushed from both coasts into this interior part of our country between the Rocky Mountains and the Appalachian Mountains. And we put them there because we didn't think that that land was worth anything. When Lewis and Clark and all the settlers go from St. Louis to the West Coast, they see just these flat plains. And if you've ever driven across that part of the country, Kansas, Nebraska, Iowa, North Dakota, South Dakota, is flat. There is just flat of nothing. And there's also no trees. And so settlers have always equated trees with fertile ground. And because there was no trees, they did not think it was fertile ground. And actually, in many of those first maps, it's labeled the Great Grass Desert because nobody thinks agriculture is going to grow in that place. We find out, oh, it does. We find out not only does it grow, but it grows very well. There's this huge aquifer underneath that area, so we have access to water. We're also going to find oil in Oklahoma, and we're going to find gold in the Dakotas. And so now we want all of those Indians out. And we really are going to give them two choices. You either become like us meaning white Americans, or we're going to put you on reservations and kill you. Those are the options. The problem with the assimilation, and that's the word, the problem with the assimilation is what happens to these Native Americans after they assimilate. They really don't fit in any world. White Americans are not going to let them move next door. There will be Native Americans that will graduate and become attorneys and doctors, but a white person at that time period is not going to go to an Indian doctor. A white person is not going to hire a Indian lawyer. Not going to let my son or daughter marry an Indian. So they're not fitting in this white world, but then when they try to go back to their tribes, they don't fit in there at all either. They're too American. So we assimilate this group of people that fit nowhere. So that's what we're looking at this part in this chapter. So we've got a couple of things: a reservation, a specific area set aside by the federal government for Indians' use. There are hundreds of thousands of Indians that live on reservations currently. The reservations are controlled or managed by the Bureau of Indian Affairs. They are sovereign nations, and that's why those of you that travel, especially as you get closer to Florida, you see all these billboards for cigarettes to buy on reservations and gambling, because those Indians are allowed to govern themselves. They don't have to pay taxes on cigarettes, and so they don't have to pay the state taxes and all that. Sand Creek Massacre, we'll talk about that. Sitting Bull. And then the last big battle, the Battle of Little Bighorn, in which the Sioux defeat General Custer. Chief Joseph will be the leader of the Nez Perce that will surrender. Wounded Knee, that will be our next movie that we watch if we're all here. I hope it's one of my favorite movies. Wounded Knee. And then again, that idea of assimilation, to adopt the culture and civilization of a dominant group in society. And assimilation is okay if that's what you want to do, right? If you want to adopt that culture, if you want to be part of that civilization, that's a great thing. But if you are made to assimilate, or made to be a part of a group, that's usually when difficulties start happening. And then lastly is the Dawes General Allotment Act, 1887 law, which we'll talk about at the end. All right, so after the Civil War, we have about 250,000 Indians that lived in the lands west of the Mississippi River. They had many diverse cultures, and that's, again, part of both the problem for Native Americans, but it's also one of the things that made it easy to conquer these Native Americans. We, as white Americans, treated these Indians in one big lump, that they were all Indians, but they were not. And many of them warred with each other, and had, again, they decided to come together, which they will eventually do, but by then it's too late. They had very different systems, belief systems. They speak different languages. They lived in different types of houses. They ate different foods. And as a result of that, for the Army of the United States of America, it makes it very easy to conquer them because they're small tribes that don't work together. Again, the few times that they decide to all work together to try to defeat the United States Army, they're successful. That's how they beat General George Custer. They all come together as a Sioux nation and annihilate Custer and all of his people. But they still don't understand that the idea of them working together is what's going to conquer, or what will allow them to keep their beliefs instead of taking their beliefs away from them. So the diverse people, however, had a common view toward nature. And again, this will be part of the difficulty as well. The ownership of land, a view that conflicted with that of white Americans. Native Americans saw themselves as part of nature, viewed nature as sacred. Many white Americans view land as a resource to produce wealth. So when we talk about treaties and land ownership, there'll be two things that will be difficult for Native Americans. One, don't understand ownership, don't understand that a deed gives you this land and you have to stay off of my land. It's the idea that land is common ground for everyone to use. The other part is these Indians are being asked to sign treaties in which they don't read what they're writing, and they're made to put their mark on a treaty and sign a treaty that signs away things that they don't understand, especially signing away land. They'll understand that they're signing away this land, but they don't get the concept that they don't get to use it any longer. And we'll watch that with our movie, Wounded Knee, especially this idea of touching the pen to the paper. That's what will be asked of them in signing treaties that, again, not only don't make any sense to them, but require them to understand concepts that their culture does not quite understand. So during the 1800s, the government carried out a policy of moving Indians out of the way of white settlers. So that's the policy. Everybody has to pick up and move. Anytime there is land that is desired by white settlers, are they out of order?
Yeah.
I'm sorry. At first, Indians in the east were moved west into the Indian Territory of the Plains. And as frontier settlers continue moving west, this plan had to change. And so then they get forced into reservations. Keep looking, Carter. I'm sorry. It's mixed up in there somewhere. So these reservations hold these Indians in one place. Plains Indians were nomadic. They moved around. That was part of their livelihood. These are the Indians that took to using horses. They were Indians that did not build permanent settlements. They lived in teepees and they followed the buffalo. And so living in one place was not normal for them, nor was not being allowed to hunt normal for them. And these reservations took away their belief systems, especially for young braves. That was part of their custom, and they were no longer allowed to roam free in the plains. And this is going to come along with two other crises. So first we'll be moving into the reservations, and then we'll have two other things that will happen to these Native Americans. One, which will destroy a large portion of these Native Americans will be diseases. They have absolutely no immunity to any of these diseases. By the 1890s, we have vaccines and inoculations, one of which will be smallpox. And most Americans either now have an immunity to smallpox or they have had the shot for smallpox. If you have any relatives older than about, I'm 56, so older than about 52-ish, if you check their arm, they have that big round, nasty looking pokey scar. That's from when they got a shot for smallpox. So check out your grandmas or grandpas and look for that. Yes. I will, and at the end, I will. So Americans have been inoculated for smallpox. Indians have not. And there will be many times where blankets will be passed to these Indians that actually have the disease in the blanket that will decimate their villages. Most important, though, is the loss of buffalo. So in those Wild West shows that we looked at in our last chapter, one of the things that becomes really popular, and we'll look at it, I think, towards the end of this, is buffalo hunts. And these buffalo hunts are built toward city men who kind of want to live out this Wild West kind of adventure. And they'll put them on trains and give them guns, and they'll pull into the middle of a buffalo herd, and then they will just have a turkey shoot with buffalo. I'm talking hundreds and hundreds of buffaloes piled up 6-7 feet high. And all they're doing is just shooting them, not using their fur, their meat, their tallow, their leather, just the sheer sake of shooting them. The reason this isn't really thought of as anything bad is because there's hundreds and millions of buffalo. But by the end of this century, buffalo will be extinct, virtually extinct. My whole childhood until probably the 1980s, buffalo were extinct. And thankfully, people in that upper Midwest, Idaho, Montana, Wyoming, have worked really hard to reintroduce the buffalo back into that society. But seriously, buffalo hunts just slaughtered the buffalo. And when those buffalo are gone, again, the way of life for the Indians will be gone, and they won't ever really be able to recover that. Oh, I forgot my cute little arrows. Sorry about that. Native Americans fought to defend their land, and that will happen with great regularity, that they will fight. They won't go down peacefully. But what happens is the Indians are up against the United States Army, and this is a United States Army after the Civil War. It has Gatling guns, it has cannons, it has rapid fire ammunition. Indians will have guns at this point. They'll have Winchester rifles, but again, it is very difficult for a tribe of 50, 60 men to hold off the United States Army. The Sand Creek Massacre saw an unarmed camp of Indians under protection of the United States Army killed by Colorado militia. And that will send, really for the first time to Americans, a really bad propaganda about the idea of what the government is doing to Indians. For the most part, white America on the East Coast is very detached from what's happening to the Indians in the plains. But this Sand Creek Massacre makes the front page of a newspaper because most of those people killed were women, elderly, and children. And that's typically what happened with reservations. The young men of a tribe did not want to be on a reservation. And so they sent their grandparents, their wives, their children to live on the reservation. So that massacre of, and I think there was about 320, were all defenseless, not armed Indians. And so this will be, when we watch our movie, Bury My Heart at Wounded Knee, this will be the opening scene that we'll look at, is the current president of the United States reading this newspaper article about this Sand Creek Massacre. Further frustration turned to violence as the government move to crush the Indian resistance. And this again will be now the policy of the United States Army, is no longer to deal with Indians as nations, as sovereign nations, but just to annihilate them. The Red River War led to the defeat of the Southern Plains Indians. The Sioux will be victorious at the Battle of Little Bighorn for two reasons. One, the Sioux Nation finally decides to fight as the Sioux Nation, and there will be thousands of Indians at this fight. The second part of it is the Battle of Little Bighorn is planned and carried out by, at that point, he's no longer a general, he's Lieutenant Colonel Custer. And he doesn't listen to his advance men, to his men that are out front telling him, hey, George, there's a lot of Indians here. We probably should turn around and go back. So Custer is approaching the Sioux Nation with about 300 men, and they are going to be annihilated. Part of the issue with the Battle of Little Bighorn is what happens to the bodies after the Battle of Little Bighorn, the desecration that occurs to the men in the army. The Sioux will scalp them, and then the part that makes it really bad for the population back on the East Coast is the Indians will cut off the men's genitalia and shove it in their mouth. Mostly as a way to humiliate and kind of show the army an embarrassment, I guess, but it is not taken very well by the people back home. Chief Joseph and the Nez Perce, they just try to make it to Canada, like we're going to go to Canada. Canada opens its borders to all of these Indians and say, come on up here, you can live here, just don't fight with each other. And there'll be lots of Indians that will take off up into Canada. The problem is it's really cold, right? These are Indians that are used to living in cold weather, North Dakota, South Dakota, Wyoming, Idaho, but even that area in Canada is just too desolate and too cold for them to continue. So here is part of the issue that finally gets us to the end. And this is this thing called the ghost dance. And it's a really, I'm sorry, this is so out of order. Sorry about that, people. I must have fed them in the machine the wrong way. So this idea of a ghost dance, and we'll again see this in our movie that we watch. As their way of life slipped away, some Indians turned to a religious revival based on a ghost dance. So the ghost dance does two things. One, this ghost dance is that white settlers are going to be banished. That in dancing this dance, white settlers are going to be banished, and the buffalo are going to return. Now, when we talk about this ghost dance, have any of you ever been to a powwow, an Indian powwow before? They are some of the most moving experiences ever, like the connection with the drums and the dancing, the beautiful costumes that they wear. But this ghost dance begins to bind these Indians together. And the army and the government begins to become really afraid that this is something that's going to link these Indians back together again. And it is a dance. It is very much anything like you've seen with Indians who are singing along with drums. And it scares the government, it scares the army, and so they start to ban this practice. You can't do this anymore. You're not allowed to do this. And again, it's part of the culture of the Indians. And so this becomes the setup that ends at Wounded Knee. In an effort to end the ghost dance, the government attempts to arrest Sitting Bull. And when they go to arrest Sitting Bull, there is a giant confrontation. There will be the United States Army. They have guns. There will be about 100 Indians, whom some will also have guns. And that is always what happens in tense situations when people have guns. Someone shoots. Both sides will say the other one shot first. But what then ends up happening is the Indians, especially the unarmed Indians, which will again mostly be elderly women, children, start to run. and then the United States Army just mows them down, just completely obliterates them. Wounded Knee ends the Indian Wars. That's the reason, again, it's important to discuss that this is what ends the Indian Wars. In the 1970s, when we have this revival of Native American rights, Native Americans are going to take over Wounded Knee again, and they're going to actually take it over as an armed resistance. There'll be an armed resistance. They'll take over Wounded Knee, and they'll also take over Alcatraz, the island of Alcatraz, in this movement in the 70s toward Native American rights. All right, any questions about that? And that is the same Sitting Bull that was in our last chapter with the Wild West shows. Our last little bit, we're almost finished. Some critics attacked government's policies and defended the Indians' way of life. Most leaders, however, hoped that Native Americans would assimilate. And again, that assimilation would have been helpful. However, the difficulty is always that white Americans are not going to accept these dark-skinned people no matter how much they assimilate. Again, no one's ever going to hire a teacher with dark skin to teach white children. No one is going to go to an Indian doctor that is white. And so the assimilation begins, but it is a difficult process. Most of these children are going to be taken from their homes and from their families at about the age of 5. They're going to be put in boarding schools. Their hair is going to be cut. They won't be allowed to speak their language, and they will work towards assimilating. Here's what you need to think and remember, again, as we talk about this. In 2021, that sounds horrific. In the 1890s, these people really honestly thought they were doing what was in the best interest of Indians. Their way of life was dead. There was no way they could exist any longer in that lifestyle, especially the children. It just seems in the time period that was the only decision that they could make. And again, hopefully in 2021, that sounds horrible to you, but most of these people were doing what they considered was in the best interest of especially Indian children. In 1887, Congress passed the Dawes General Allotment Act to encourage assimilation. And what happens then is Indians get land. And again, this is the weird dichotomy between white America and Indians. For white America, this makes sense. Let's give them land, make them farmers. For these Indians who were plains nomadic following the buffalo, land meant nothing. They're not farmers. They still aren't farmers. Indians in this reservation system in the 21st century still have land. They don't farm it. They are not farmers. And we'll see that often spoke about in the movie that we watch, especially with Sitting Bull, that he's not going to eat your food that you grow. I'll eat what I've eaten and what my ancestors ate, but the land gives us. And again, makes it difficult that the land can't be sold for 25 years. So again, trying to deal with this group of people that have nothing in common, nothing similar with white Americans, make that really difficult. And finally, our last, how did the pressures of westward expansion impact Native Americans? As settlers continue to push west, they increasingly came into conflict, and that conflict is going to lead to violence and tragic results. So you have a set of worksheets to look at for today and tomorrow. One of them deals with a young girl that is put into a boarding school. So you get to see her experience of losing her language, her hair, her clothing. The other one is a political cartoon of how Indians looked at Native Americans. And then finally, a biography of a lady who understood the way that the government had treated Indians and wrote about this century of dishonor that the United States government conducted on Native Americans. Okay, Carter, which one do we need to go back to? What's at the top?
I'm pretty sure the one before the last one. Like the last slide, the one right before that.
Which one? That one? Have I gone back too far?
Yeah, I have like 3 of them.
This one, Ghost Dance?
No, it's the Dawes.
The Dawes Act? Okay. This one? Okay. So tomorrow there will not be a lecture. You just need to make sure that you finish both of those assignments. I have both of them, I think, due tomorrow. So, and then Thursday we'll finish up our notes, and our test is going to be on Tuesday. Did you get it, hon?
Yeah, I got it.